through some of Walter Harding's early correspondence about I've had the pleasure of reading through some of Walter Harding's early letters about the history of the Thoreau Society. And he says the very first meeting 84 years ago was pouring rain at 11 o'clock at the cabin, and then 90 degrees and humid when they were in a hall for a lecture. And he said that set the pattern for every annual gathering since. So here we are. A pleasure to see you all. I hope most of you were able to catch Peter Worsbricky's really wonderful opening plenary address last night. And some of you were able to see Ali's really wonderful talk up at Walden Woods. We'll get a chance to see him later this week. Thank you for coming from across the country, across the world. We're happy to gather. It's always a highlight of the year for us. And we hope it is for you as well. We find it energizing and connecting and powerful in a moment that's often fraught and difficult for all of us. So I hope we gain energy from our time together. It's the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So Concord's thinking about issues of revolution and belonging and protest. And we are going to have a long conversation about what that looks like in Thoreau's world and in ours. I want to give some thanks as we get started here to Connie Baxter Marlowe is taking pictures. Thank you, Connie. Carla and Joni have been manning the food stations. We have coffee and some refreshments. Thank you, folks. Wes is helping everything run smoothly at the Trinity Episcopal Church. Say hello if you see him and thank him for his work, and the folks at TEC. Of course, our incredible staff on the Thoreau Society, Rebecca, who kind of makes this work, Rich Picaretto, Corinne Smith. We have Mia helping out on, Mia Farrow, helping out with our tech. So we're grateful to have you here, making sure it runs smoothly for our online audience. Welcome from wherever you're zooming in from. And our really wonderful AG committee that put together, once again, a really stunning conference for us. And some folks are here in the room right now, some are not, but Casey Dolan, Christy Ellis, Dennis Nosen, Beverly Pittman, Paul Schacht, and Mark Sturgis. Thanks all of you for helping build a really rich conversation in a way that we hope is powerful and manageable for all of us to soak in all the really wonderful ideas we all have. Let me briefly acknowledge that we're on the land of the Mosquitoquid people who were here really since the end of the last ice age, part of the broader network of Native people in Massachusetts and their close relatives in Pawtucket and Nipmuc territory. They were also thinking about revolution in different kinds of ways, welcoming the English settlers who arrived here, and this is why the place is called Concord, as a place where people were trying to live in harmony. That kind of worked for a while until it very much didn't. The Mosquitoquid people were asked to leave and go to the next town over and settle in Neshoba. They became the 6 of the praying Indian villages, where they tried the experiment of adopting English ways while still remaining very much a distinct people. And that worked well for a few years until it didn't. And King Philip's War, Metacom's rebellion broke out, and they were caught in the vice of that, seized from Concord, dragged to Deer Island. And from there, they survived, but weren't able to rebuild their village. And so they scattered to their relatives in Natick and elsewhere, but are still very much around and reconstituting their community in Neshoba and across Massachusetts, part of the broader network of Native revitalization, which is ongoing, and a very long-term and powerful work of revolution we all can learn from as we learn to love this land we all share better. We need their wisdom now more than ever. Thoreau got that indication. He thought about revolution a lot. He was fascinated by Concord's revolutionary heritage. He thought about himself in many ways as a soldier, not part of an organized militia or army, but someone who was trying to live out a sense of principle and duty. In the same way the Minutemen at Northbridge were trying to figure out what it meant for them to be loyal to higher principles than expediency. And Thoreau also thought about revolution in much broader terms as well, to revolutionize how we think about our spiritual life, our economic life, our connections to our neighbors, human and more than human. And so we'll continue a long conversation about what that means for Thoreau and for us as we go on through our conference. A couple comments about events. There's a couple spots available as people drop out for some of the Friday morning sessions. Check in at the front desk if you have a question, you want to sneak onto one. We'll have the canoe trip, we'll have the trip to the Walden Woods Project to see the collections, and we'll have, I'm spacing, a book talk in at Thoreau Farm on Robert McFarland's The Wild Places. We'll also have a gallery talk here by artists who contributed to the first annual art show, part of the annual gathering. Rebecca Migdal had this idea and made it happen, got just an incredible array of wonderful artists to submit their work. So please enjoy these. They're meant to be part of our conversation today, and the artists will be around on Friday to really talk through what they've done and share their work. We will be really privileged to have these. I think a few are for sale as well, if you find one that you just can't leave. We're also doing for the first time lunches at the church here. You should have ordered a box lunch beforehand. If you didn't and you want to bring a lunch back here, we'd love to have you. We're going to have some informal table sessions this afternoon during lunch and on Saturday. Today's topics are based on your own requests. Thoreau in poetry, the neurodivergent Thoreau, Thoreau in kids, protest, and Thoreau quotes, and today's Thoreau. So if any of those topics catch your interest, come by. There'll be a table with a little note on it saying, here's our topic, and some people there who are going to just be ready to have a conversation. We're going to try it again on Saturday on topics that are more about the visions and goals for the Thoreau Society, our publications, our fellowships, other kinds of long-term dreams, and the proposed merger as well. So if you want to dig into really what the society might look like in a year, 5 years, 50 years, please take part in that conversation on Saturday. We really want to hear from everybody. Again, we are the community, we are the people who are here in this room, and so we want to just make sure we get everything we can out of you while you're here. Your ideas, your concerns, your hopes as we move forward. Please note that on Friday please note too that we're trying to arrange some carpooling. There'll be some signs on the registration table with people who volunteered to carpool for today, back and forth to the dinner at the Colonial Inn, and for Friday to some of the different events. So if you're willing to share a ride, you can put your name down with your cell phone number. If you want to get a ride, be aware of that and just be in touch with one of the people who's there. And we'll try to coordinate those as we're ready to move to get people who are ready to carpool hanging out by the table so we can kind of get people into cars. It's not a terribly long walk, but on a rainy day, it feels a lot longer. Friday evening is our sneak preview of the Thoreau documentary being put together by the Ken Burns production team of the Ewers brothers. We're excited to have that happen. A lot of folks who are in this room took part, and it's going to be a real momentous event when it's released in the next year or so. We'll get a firmer sense of what that looks like as they're here, but it's super exciting in terms of bringing the Thoreau message to the wider world. And then on Saturday, after our members meeting, we'll have our keynote with Camille Dungy, followed by a series of programs. Those are free and open to anybody. So please invite friends, relatives, neighbors. Let's get people here and get them hooked on the magic of what happens at the annual gathering. It's tremendous. And we'll end on Saturday with our book sale with, I think, about 24 authors who'll be ready to hawk their wares and engage in conversation. There's some exciting books that have come out and are coming out right now and have been out for a bit. So please get a chance to talk to people who put in some of the real labor of trying to really understand and convey some of what they find most compelling about Thoreau's work and his world. And then Sunday's programs will all be at Thoreau Farm. So just be aware of that. We did a program change recently to make sure that we're all in the same place. I think that's it. We have a wonderful program here. I'll turn things over to my colleague, Michael Schleifer.
Thank you, John. Too much technology up here. Anybody remember my password? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I should have made something. Anyway, good morning. For those of you who I haven't met, there are a few of you here. I am Michael Schleifer. I've been on the Thoreau Society Board of Directors for much too long. Currently the treasurer. And for those of you I have met before, I am Michael Schleifer, still. When I first read about what this year's topic was, I immediately thought back to a book I had read about 10 years ago, written much earlier than that, and very apropos for these times. And that's Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. In the introduction to that book, there was an excerpt from Lewis's critique, a review of Walden. It was written in the 1930s. And he said this about Thoreau. He said, once upon a time in America, there was a scholar who conducted a one-man revolution and won it. I said, wow, what a, how incredibly timeful to have that thought at this time when the conditions we have in this country being what they are. The presenters on this morning's panel need no introduction to either Concordians or Thoreau Society members. But humor me, I'll introduce them anyway. I am very fortunate to have worked with all of them. Bob Gross is Professor Emeritus of Early American History at the University of Connecticut. His first book, The Minutemen and Their World, received the Bancroft Prize in American History in 1977. A revised and expanded edition appeared in 2022 in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. And I think we're long overdue for another one now. His latest book, The Transcendentalists and Their World, is a cultural study of major American writers that traces the impact of capitalism, democracy, and social reform on 19th century Concord. It was chosen by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 10 best books of 2021 and was recognized by the Massachusetts Historical Society as the best non-fictional book on Massachusetts history published in 2021. I heard that title of that award. I wonder, is there an award for the best fictional book on Massachusetts history? Before coming to UConn, Professor Gross taught at Amherst College and the College of William and Mary. He has also held visiting positions at Brandeis and Brown universities. Bob is a trustee of the Concord Museum and has served on the board of directors of the Thoreau Society and the Councils of American Antiquarian Society and Colonial Society of Massachusetts. He was awarded the Thoreau Society Medal in 2023. Bob has been a resident of Concord since 2014. Lastly, Bob and I share an acquaintance, a gentleman known in Brooklyn as the unofficial mayor of Coney Island. If you think you'd like to know more about this, rest assured you don't. Okay, I'm being told that the introduction is not supposed to be longer than the presentation, so please join me in welcoming Bob Gross.
There will be no hot dog eating contest today. I remembered finally to bring my own flashlight. So if you're not paying attention, I can see where you are. Well, it's long been known that Henry Thoreau's forebears had divided loyalties in the American Revolution. On the paternal side, his grandfather, Jean Thoreau, sided with the Patriots. Within a few years of arriving in Massachusetts from the Isle of Jersey, he is said to have signed up on privateers to attack enemy ships, capture their cargo, and advance the cause of independence. Thanks to the success of these ventures, he gained the financial stake that enabled his rise to wealth as a Boston merchant. On the maternal side, Thoreau traced his antecedents back to Elisha Jones of Weston, Massachusetts, a rich and influential figure in town, county, and province. The patriarch of a large family of a dozen adult children, with 11 sons and 1 daughter, Thoreau's grandmother Mary. With that large brood, the Squire of Weston faithfully upheld the cause of royal government in all the crises from the Stamp Act through the Boston Tea Party. Only in 1774, after mobs in Middlesex County threatened his safety, did he flee the embattled countryside for the protection of redcoats in occupied Boston. Colonel Jones was in the process of raising a regiment to fight for the king when he died early in 1776. 5 of his sons followed his lead into the Loyalist ranks, and lost the family fortune as a result of that choice. Where the newcomer Jean Thoreau enjoyed the classic immigrant's rise from rags to riches, the Joneses fell from the apex of the colonial line and dispersed in new homes in the English-speaking Atlantic world, from northern New England to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, to the rising Canadian province of Ontario, and to the mother country herself. The story of Thoreau's Revolutionary era relatives is actually more interesting and more complicated than this bare bones narrative, as I've discovered in researching the genealogy, especially the Jones side of the family. What I'd like to do today is to report some of my findings, then ask how, if at all, the experiences of his kinfolk in the Revolution affected Thoreau's thinking about the new American Republic and about the possibilities of freedom it came to represent. Let's start with John Thoreau, the immigrant. According to Franklin B. Sanborn, he was 19 years old when he showed up in Boston, the survivor of a shipwreck. Since he was born in 1759 on the Isle of Jersey, excuse me. Since he was born in 1759 on the Isle of Jersey, that puts his arrival in 1773. What was the ill-fated vessel on which he traveled? No record apparently survives. But does a ship disappear without a trace? The newspapers from that era teem with reports of sunken and beached ships. A search for wrecks in the Boston press for 1773 in early American newspapers turns up 176 pieces, many, of course, reprints of the same original, but none are likely candidates for the vessel carrying Thoreau to America. If you doubt me, I invite you to read all the reports of shipwrecks in early American newspapers. It is a tedious job. One ship that foundered on the Massachusetts shore that year is well known, at least to recent historians of the American Revolution. It is the William, one of 4 vessels dispatched by the East India Company to its Boston agent with 92,000 pounds of tea in its hold for sale under the controversial terms of the Tea Act. 3 ships reached port, and as you well know, their cargo of 342 chests were dumped from Griffin's Wharf into the sea in what became known in the 1820s as the Boston Tea Party. The William escaped that fate. It was caught up in a fierce North Atlantic gale and blown off course to Cape Ann. As its captain, Joseph Loring, struggled to save his ship and crew, he shifted course and sought safety in the open sea. Eventually, off Cape Cod, a couple miles north of Truro, the brigantine beached the shore. Neither goods nor men were lost. And neither goods nor men were lost. And despite the tax, some of the tea was sold to customers on the Cape, and the rest was later drunk by redcoats and loyalists in Boston. Was this the ship on which John Thoreau worked his way across the Atlantic? No passengers were on board, so if John Thoreau made that harrowing trip, he was in the crew. I'm guessing that was the case, since the Thoreau family remembered only the sparse details, 1773 and shipwreck, without the context that would give them meaning. In the wake of the revolution, it would surely have made, it surely would have been embarrassing to the rising merchant, now the anglicized John Thoreau, to admit that his American story began on a ship carrying the detested tea, and that his were among the many hands engaged in imposing taxation without representation on the colonists. Take that, Frank Sanborn. As it would turn out, John Thoreau was no loyalist, and he cleared his reputation through military service. The family story had it. The family story had it that the immigrant was laboring at a cooper's shop in 1775 when the outbreak of war threw him out of work. So he turned to privateering as a means of supporting himself in his new country. Well, that's not exactly right. John Thoreau was actually a full-time soldier in the Massachusetts Regiment of Artillery from May 1777 to May 1780, as the multi-volume series Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the American Revolution discloses. In this, in this massive compendium of muster rolls, payrolls, receipts, and other sources are 5 entries for John Thoreau, whose surname is creatively misspelled 4 times. Still, there is no mistaking the evidence of the young man's participation in a unique military unit. Charged with defending Boston Harbor and the Massachusetts coast, the State Artillery Regiment resembled the Continental Army in demanding a long-term enlistment, unlike the voluntary companies mobilized for limited campaigns of weeks or months. Its top officers included some of Boston's leading opponents of British power, most notably Colonel Paul Revere. For 3 years, Thoreau put in his time as a gunner, a specialist in aiming, maintaining, and firing cannon, and he rose to the rank of sergeant. And cannon, I would add, are the weapons of mass destruction in 18th century warfare, crucial for the ability of the colonists to hold their own. And he rose to the rank of sergeant. Much of that service was uneventful. The high point surely came in January 1779, when Revere's men captured a British vessel approaching Boston Harbor with prisoners of war to trade for redcoats in American hands. Expecting safe passage, the Minerva was easily seized, its commercial cargo claimed as a prize. With the approval of Massachusetts Maritime Court, the proceeds were split between the soldiers and the state. The regiment's share was then divided among the officers and the enlisted man, John Thoreau included. That prize money and the connections the sergeant made with important figures in Boston politics, particularly Revere and Thomas Craft, who was a planner of the Stamp Act protest and a participant in the destruction of the tea. Those connections laid the foundation of the family fortune. I'm guessing that Paul Revere, himself descended from French Huguenot origins, saw a good reason to want to sponsor and patronize the shipwrecked Jean Thoreau, who he might have seen as a kind of countryman. In any case, the prize money and the connections the sergeant made with important figures in Boston politics, especially Revere and Crafts, put him on his way. They laid the foundation of the family fortune, and the proud new citizen, John Thoreau, was more than a mercenary privateer. Whatever the route by which he had come to America, he had proven himself a patriot. Colonel Elisha Jones of Weston stood for everything the Sons of Liberty in Boston loathed. Crafts and company were upwardly striving artisans on the rise into what was called the gentility. Elisha Jones belonged to a well-established family in Middlesex County, in the Middlesex County town of Weston, where his great-grandfather had settled in 1650. And when the neighborhood was still part of Watertown, Weston became a separate town in 1713. One generation after another served as selectmen, militia officers, and church deacons. No one ranked higher than the great-grandfather of Henry Thoreau. The humidity is sticking pages to one another. Okay. He occupied the apex of wealth and power during the 1750s and early 1760s, the era of the French and Indian War. He was a 5-time selectman in these years, and at times also town clerk and treasurer. Simultaneously, he represented Weston in the provincial assembly for 10 terms, consistently supporting the court party of the royal governor. For his loyalty as a friend to government, he received prestigious and lucrative appointments as Justice of the Peace and Colonel of the County Militia. As Jones rose in influence, he gained in wealth. He opened the first store in Weston, which gave him one of the most extensive businesses outside Boston. With the profits, he became Weston's banker, loaning money to neighbors and bankrolling the town government. In Boston, he joined with other powerful men to speculate in land on the Bay Colony's frontiers in Berkshire County to the far west and in Goldsboro down east in the District of Maine. Such investments were farsighted, since Jones had to provide 11 sons with farms and daughter Mary with a fortune. As the protests against British imperial policies mounted, Jones returned to the political fray and employed his influence to keep Weston on the side of royal government. The town never spoke out against the Stamp Act. It didn't endorse a boycott of British goods. It said nothing about the tea tax, and it refused to appoint a committee of correspondence. Concord followed much the same course. And Jones was often an ally of Concord's Charles Prescott, who had been in the legislature at the same time as Jones. The town, in May 1773, Jones once again stood to the legislature, winning Weston's seat by a hair's breadth, only to find his victory challenged when it was alleged that one freeman in Weston had voted twice. They were rigging the election, people said. The assembly ordered Weston to try again. Jones prevailed once more by a single vote. But by the time he took his seat, the legislative session was nearly over. Jones soon lost his political standing and then his very place in Weston. For as long as possible, the colonel called out the militia to preserve order as mobs gathered to pressure friends of government to recant support for the new regime Britain was trying to impose on Massachusetts in punishment for the Tea Party. Jones himself had to issue a public statement to mollify angry opponents. It was no use. Near the end of 1774, he sought sanctuary in occupied Boston, and there he became an intimate advisor to Governor Thomas Gage. He died in, 3 of his sons enlisted he was an intimate advisor to Gage and worked to raise a military force of loyalists to fight for king and parliament. 3 of his sons enlisted. Jones never got to see them take the field. He died in February 1776, unlamented by many of the people in Weston who had once deferred to his leadership. His vast estate was confiscated and sold off. In 1785, it was estimated by his sons to have been worth close to 16,500 pounds sterling. The elegant dwelling house in Weston, with its various outbuildings, alone accounted for £7,000. He left behind 5 farms in Weston, plus substantial acreage in Berkshire and Worcester County. He would never have anticipated having a great grandson who thought that the great gift is in wanting nothing. Not included in the inventory was a possession that may have embarrassed his descendants, 2 enslaved Black people, one of whom, Cicero, helped his master's son Josiah avoid capture after fleeing from a Concord jail. Henry Thoreau recorded the anecdote in his journal and said nothing about his ancestors' complicity in slaveholding. The 3 sons who itemized these losses for Britain's Loyalist Claims Commission would gain only limited compensation. Still, all Jones' advanced planning had ensured that none of his heirs would be destitute, and a few would eventually rival their father in economic success and political renown in Britain's Canadian provinces. With 3 of her brothers officially banished from Massachusetts and 5 altogether making new lives in Canada and England, Mary Jones preserved a living legacy of loyalism within her own family. Her first husband, Reverend Asa Dunbar, was junior minister of the First Church of Salem. The couple lived in the Jones homestead in Weston, from which the parson traveled for Sabbath worship in the port town of Salem. Wherever he resided, Dunbar was no enthusiast in the Patriot cause. On July 25th, when the 13 United Colonies followed the advice of the Continental Congress and observed a fast day to promote national unity, Dunbar could not keep his dissenting opinions to himself. Weston's Committee of Correspondence, established just 10 months earlier in the wake of Colonel Jones's political collapse, demanded an explanation. Fearful of imprisonment or worse, the pastor, who had once sparked a riot in Harvard's dining hall by complaining about the food, he said, "The butter stinketh." The tutor said, "The butter stinketh not." And then there was a food fight. He hastened to assure the Liberty men of Weston that he had meant no harm and was sorry if anyone was offended. We know this today as the non-apology apology. Prudently, he and Mary would decamp for Keene, New Hampshire, where a couple of Jones brothers lived nearby and practiced law, a profession the minister would soon take up. Dunbar died in 1787 when his infant daughter Cynthia was not even a month old, and his widow struggled to support her family on her own for 11 years, keeping a boarding house and a tavern, a steep fall from the glories of Weston. Then in 1798, she was courted by an old political ally of her father, Captain Jonas Minot of Concord, who had collaborated with the colonel in a doomed bid to head off the rising militancy of the Middlesex militia. The marriage that stemmed from this loyalist connection brought the 50-year-old mother and her 3 children, including 11-year-old Cynthia, to the Minot farm on Virginia Road. In Concord, the union of patriot and loyalist family lines would bring forth Henry David Thoreau. And now I'm about to wind up. But he would never tell a loyalist story. Instead, when he sat down in June 1837 to compose an autobiography for his Harvard class book, Henry Thoreau put himself in a direct line of descent from the French Huguenot immigrant from the Isle of Jersey, who took an active part in the War of Independence and brought his family to Concord, the town, as he called it, of revolutionary memory. Sharing the pride felt by his neighbors at their town's role in American history, the young man forgot entirely about his Jones forebears in their fall from grace, never said a word in public about their slaveholding, and boasted like Chanticleer of his patriot legacy. In whatever quarter of the world I may wander, he pledged, I shall deem it my good fortune that I hail from Concord North Bridge. He identified with the patriot cause. How did Weston's Jones Mansion disappear from the genealogy? Why did Thoreau never give equal time to his Loyalist heritage and reflect on its meaning? Given his revulsion at the mindless patriotism of the day, there was a maggot in their heads, he said. Might he not have reflected on his great-grandfather's quest for an alternative to war and independence? I leave these questions to our further discussion. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
We'll have to start from the beginning.
Oh, can I? If everybody looks under their seat, see if you find a green baseball cap with a Moose emblem on it. Or if you saw one yesterday, let me know.
Thank you, Bob. Hold on one second here. Let's see. Bob, what was that password again? Rich Higgins, our next speaker. Rich is a writer, book coach, and author or editor of 5 books, including Thoreau's God, which was published last year by the University of Chicago, and Thoreau, The Language of Trees, published, I think, around 2013. Do I have the year? 17. By the University of California. Richard is a former staff writer at the Boston Globe, and he was a member of the Thoreau Society Board of Directors for the past 6 years. His talk is entitled Thoreau's Inner Revolution. Please welcome Rich Higgins.
Well, hi, thank you very much for welcoming me. And since John mentioned the first meeting of the Thoreau Society in 1941, in doing some research, I came across, I don't know if it was a 3rd or 4th meeting of the Thoreau Society. There's I found in the archives, a man described Thoreau in a sentence that surpasses whatever I've written about Thoreau and much else about Thoreau. He said that Thoreau could get more out of an afternoon with a woodchuck than most men could get from a whole night with Cleopatra. You know, why write a book when you've got that? Okay, so, all right, my talk is Thoreau's Inner Revolution. Excuse me. And Concord first began to mark the historic events of April 19, 1775, only in 1825, the 50th anniversary of the battle that launched the American Revolutionary War. The town did it again in 1835, and more grandly in 1837, when to mark the, so I did it in 1837 to mark the completion of the battle monument at the North Bridge, and for which Emerson wrote his famous hymn about the shot fired around the world. Now, Thoreau was a young man at the time, and as his neighbors sang and marched and gave speeches and lit bonfires to toast their political freedom on April 19, Thoreau didn't think they were very free in the true sense of that word. To him, they seemed mired in social mores and material pursuits that entrapped them And indeed, much of Thoreau's writing could be called a critique of a liberty that is merely civil, as he wrote. In order to truly honor 1775, Thoreau believed, a more interior revolution was needed, something similar to the experiment in self-emancipation he would undertake at Walden Pond, of course, beginning on Independence Day, 1845. Thoreau saw political freedom as a means to moral and spiritual freedom, freedom from rank materialism, racism, and a purely utilitarian view of nature. He also thought it meant freedom from religious doctrines and institutions that bound the spirit rather than expanded it. Quote, "Men talk of freedom," he wrote on May 6, 1858. "How many are really free to think, free from fear, free from perturbation, free from prejudice," close quote. And 21 years earlier, Thoreau had written the fiery Orestes Bronson, quote, "It hath not entered into the heart of man to conceive the full import of that word, freedom. Not a paltry Republican freedom, but a freedom proportionate to the dignity of his nature." In essence, a revolt is merely a good start. Its promise is that it will inaugurate not only a new political or social system, but a new human being. What mattered was the process of revolving, a process Thoreau saw writ large in nature. On September 2, 1851, he wrote that the leaves of the prunella, an herbaceous wildflower by the roadside near his house, had turned this delicate claret color on the cusp of fall. And Thoreau wrote, "I am interested in these revolutions as much as in those of kingdoms." Thoreau thought his neighbor's devotion to commerce and possessions abrogated the freedom won for them in 1775 through 1783. In a speech at his Harvard commencement in 1837, the same year the Battle Monument was dedicated and Emerson wrote his hymn, Thoreau decried the, quote, "blind and unmanly love of wealth," close quote. "The world," he declared, "is more wonderful than it is convenient, more beautiful than it is useful," close quote. And in Walden, he wrote that many people, even in this comparatively free country, are so occupied with facetious cares and superfluous labors that its finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. Thoreau recognized that limits on our freedom can be subtle. He writes in Walden that relying on coffee, tea, butter, milk, and beef led people to work excessively and become entangled in unjust economic systems. Quote, "The only true America is that country where you are at liberty to do without these, where the state does not compel you to sustain the slavery and the war and other superfluous expenses that directly or indirectly result from the use of such things," close quote. Now, today, we can easily obtain organic tea, butter, and milk, but we may rely on other things that limit our freedom, like clothing and phones produced in Asian workhouses, or social media algorithms that take up space in our minds. Quote, "The question," Thoreau asked, "is whether you can bear freedom. At present, the vast majority of men, whether white or black, require the discipline of labor, which enslaves them for their own good." Ever the wordsmith, Thoreau cleverly invoked the rhetoric of the American Revolutionary War to make his point. Quote, "We tax ourselves unjustly," he wrote in his journal, February 16th, 1851. There is a part of us which is not represented. It is taxation without representation. We quarter troops upon ourselves. We do not worship truth, but the reflection of truth, because we are absorbed in and narrowed by trade and commerce and agriculture, which are but means and not the end, as we heard from Peter last night. Another way Americans were not free, in Thoreau's view, was the existence of slavery and the endemic racism that he saw all around him. Quote, "What is it to be free from King George III and can continue to be slaves of King prejudice?" he asked, "in life without principle? What is it to be born free and not to live free? What is the value of any political freedom, but as a means to moral freedom?" Thoreau called for a quote unquote peaceable revolution in his essay, Civil Disobedience. Such a revolution, a peaceable revolution, occurs on longer and more invisible cycles than the churning contingencies of politics. It begins, Thoreau tells us, when we critically examine the social mores and conventions that have been handed down to us. Quote, "All men recognize the right of revolution, that is the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are great and unendurable. But almost all say such is not the case now, but such was the case, they think, in 1775. But in order for the enslaved to be emancipated, Americans first had to emancipate themselves. It is almost frivolous," Thoreau mused in Walden, quote, "to attend the gross but somewhat foreign form of servitude called Negro slavery. There are so many keen and subtle masters that enslave both North and South. It is hard to have a Southern overseer. It is worse to have a Northern one, but worst of all, when you are the slave driver of yourself." Thoreau also saw a need for spiritual freedom, for freedom from institutions and creeds that narrowed the soul and sought to define or control the human experience of the sacred. Quote, "The wisest man preaches no doctrines," he wrote in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. "He sees not a rafter, not even a cobweb against the heavens in his clear sky." And in his journal on October 26, 1853, he wrote, What other liberty is there worth having if we have not freedom and peace in our minds, if our inmost and private man is but a sour and turbid pool," close quote. Thoreau depicted religious freedom as a rare commodity, at least in Middlesex County. He writes in Walden that this county has many fine houses and churches of brick or stone, quote, "but very few halls for free worship or free speech," close quote. And he made his point with levity. Quote, "What great interval is there," he asked on February 28, 1857, "between him who is caught in Africa and made a plantation slave in the South and him who is caught in New England and made a Unitarian minister?" Thoreau's writings about religion were among his most revolutionary. He took religious language back from the churches and refused to let them have the last say about God. Declining to fit God into a theological shoebox, he urged his readers to know God through direct, unmediated experience. And he believed in the capacity of people to freely and intuitively grasp the spiritual and moral laws of nature on their own. Ultimately, Thoreau believed that we gain moral and spiritual freedom from our engagement with the natural world. Wildness was a regenerative and liberating force for Thoreau, and he saw living in an intimate relationship with nature as a form of liberation. "Society is constraint," he wrote in his journal, "but nature is freedom to me." And in his essay, Walking, he said, he wrote that he said he wished to speak a word for absolute freedom and wildness as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil, to regard man as an inhabitant or as a part and parcel of nature rather than a member of society, close quote. Well, Thoreau never urged people to the barricades. His jeremiads about freedom were more subtle, more literary, and philosophical. But his writings amount to a revolution in thought in what we value and how we live our lives. Thoreau hoped his readers would revolve in a new direction, but he was wise enough to know that this would take a long time. Quote, we are a nation of politicians concerned about the outsides of freedom, the means and outmost defenses of freedom, he wrote February 16th, 1851. It is our children's children who may perchance be essentially free, and that would be us. What is the value of political freedom, but as a means to moral freedom? Thoreau's question has only become sharper, more challenging, and more necessary to ask today. Thank you.
Be up all night thinking about that question. Your programs indicate that Don Jeweler and Elizabeth Schofield were supposed to speak today. Unfortunately, they were unable to make it. And those of you who heard about Don had a little medical emergency, but as far as we know, he's doing well and recuperating, and sends his regrets that he couldn't be here today. But if I delve into a different mode that I exhibit a different life. Your attention, please, ladies and gentlemen. Pinch hitting for Jeweler. I want to thank our longtime editor of the Thoreau Society Bulletin, and I might also say a joyful musical collaborator, Brent Ranalli, who has graciously agreed to move his presentation to this morning, lest you had to listen to me any longer. Brent's presentation is Henry Thoreau, Thomas Paine, and the Maldistribution of Land and Wealth. Brent?
You have to know my password? All right. Is that okay? All right. Thank you, Michael. And thanks, everybody. So this talk, yeah, I'm tempted to say a little, as Monty Python would say, now for something completely different. This is a little bit different. It was not designed for this specific panel, but I hope you will enjoy it. The topic of this talk is related to a book that I wrote that was published in 2021, Commonwealth Dividends History and Theory. It's there on the slide. If anyone wants to read the book, the first chapter is posted on my website, and you're also welcome to email me, and I will send you the whole thing electronically. So I want to talk about economic inequality. The common wisdom on this subject is that what drives inequality of wealth is not so much income, but ownership of assets. Assets produce wealth passively, like stocks and bonds, or actively as tools and resources we can use, what Marx called the means of production. And assets of any kind can be investments that appreciate in value over time. For most of human history, the most important asset was land. A little bit of land meant self-sufficiency and economic security, and a lot of land meant wealth and power. Having no land meant precarity, so the distribution of land mattered. With that in mind, let's see what Thoreau has to say about economic inequality in Walden. He writes, just in proportion as some have been placed in outward circumstances above the savage, others have been degraded below him. The luxury of one class is counterbalanced by the indigence of another. On the one side is the palace, on the other are the almshouse and silent poor. Thoreau refers to the savage as the baseline here, and on the very next page of Walden, he refers even more specifically to the North American Indian as enjoying a standard of living that was modest, but better than that of the degraded poor of so-called civilized nations. And that wasn't just Thoreau's conceit. He is repeating here an observation about the so-called noble savage that was a staple of Enlightenment thinking. Thomas Paine, for example, leading light of the American and French revolutions, wrote something very similar to what Thoreau did. The life of an Indian is a continual holiday compared with the poor of Europe, and on the other hand, it appears to be abject when compared to the rich. Civilization, therefore, or that which is so called, has operated two ways: to make one part of society more affluent and the other more wretched than would have been the lot of either in a natural state. This is from Thomas Paine's 1797 pamphlet, Agrarian Justice. In this pamphlet, Paine offers an explanation for the difference. It is unequal access to land that divides Europeans into obscenely rich and degraded poor. And it is relatively equal access to land that makes Native American societies humane and equitable. We can extend this analysis and point to structural reasons why land regimes develop differently in the Old and New Worlds. Native American societies, at least those of the northeastern woodlands, practiced a sort of horticulture that was extensive rather than intensive. Fields would be shifted every few years as a matter of course. So it was a simple matter for a band or its leaders to reallocate land as needed for equitability. In the Old World, on the other hand, intensive farming was the norm as far back as Mesopotamia some 10,000 years ago. Labor was invested in land to make it productive and keep it fertile. And when individuals and families had made such investments, it was not a simple matter to reallocate plots to keep things equitable. Furthermore, from the earliest days in Mesopotamia, farming was integrated into a money economy. As a general rule, plots of farmland could be bought and sold and mortgaged. This made equitable distribution of farmland, when it existed, inherently unstable. A society's economic winners would tend to consolidate landholdings, and its economic losers would become landless, and commonly even enslaved for defaulting on debt. And I've got a slide here for an essential book on this subject, David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. This natural degradation of equitability in old world land regimes was obviously intolerable, and ancient societies developed a variety of political solutions to deal with it. In Mesopotamia, a common solution was that when a new monarch took power, they reset land ownership. Debts were forgiven, debt slaves were freed, and every family got its traditional plot of land back. And then conditions were permitted to deteriorate again. In ancient Israel, this was adapted into the tradition of the Jubilee. Every 50 years, debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and land ownership was reset. In Sparta, farmland was held in common and assigned in plots to citizens, much like in North America, except that in Sparta, the actual farming was done by an enslaved underclass. In Athens, the lawgiver Solon not only forgave debts, he also tried to outlaw debt slavery among citizens. Athens and Rome and many other ancient societies used imperialism as a safety valve. Conquer other lands and settle your citizens there, and you don't have to do any uncomfortable redistribution at home. Obviously, this is not a solution that can be sustained indefinitely. Ultimately, when a society failed to find some way to re-enfranchise their landless poor, the natural outcome was revolution. Land redistribution has been a common theme of political revolutions from the ancient world right up to the French Revolution, which was what prompted Thomas Paine to write his pamphlet. Paine's pamphlet doesn't just diagnose this problem of maldistribution of land leading to poverty and revolution, it also offers a solution, in fact, a simple and quite clever solution. Paine acknowledged that in intensive agricultural regimes, it is not easy to redistribute landholdings. But he offered the insight that equitability does not actually require redistribution of landholdings. All it requires is redistribution of the wealth that flows from landholding. Paine proposed an estate tax of 10% on real estate inheritance that would pay into a common fund, which would pay out to every member of a society. This would be a minimally invasive redistribution of wealth. The poor and landless would, for the first time in European history, enjoy genuine economic security. The wealthy, for their part, would not have to give up or divide up their estates, and better than that, in return for contributing their fair share into the common pot, they would no longer need to fear hungry mobs with pitchforks. Paine's plan was not put into effect by its first generation of readers, but the insight was borrowed and reinvented by others, applied to land and also to other assets that are part of our common inheritance. 19th century American reformer Henry George famously envisioned a robust tax on land. Whereas Paine had proposed to distribute the money to individuals, George proposed to use the revenue to fund government services. But he also approved of distributing excess funds to individuals, for the quotes on the slide. Around 1980, Alaska implemented the Alaska Permanent Fund, which takes a portion of royalties from oil drilling and places them into an investment fund that pays annual dividends to all residents of the state. Many jurisdictions tax carbon emissions, and some of those jurisdictions distribute a portion of the revenue to individuals as dividends. There are proposals to do more, to gather revenue and pay dividends based on extraction of groundwater for profit by big bottlers, and mining for deep sea minerals for the rare earth elements that are in our phones, and media companies' use of the electromagnetic broadcast spectrum. There is a distinction to be drawn between assets that are created by the efforts of private parties and assets that are a common inheritance. So a Georgist land tax would charge the full rental value of land, but would charge little or no tax on buildings or other improvements made on the land. Here we have a graph produced by a mining watchdog organization in India, showing the relative proportion of a mining company's revenue, that's the black bar on the left, that is contributed by the operations of the company and its employees, which can be considered a just reward for labor and entrepreneurship. That's the blue bars on the top. And that which is contributed by the value of the mineral itself, which is a common inheritance and ought to be shared by the whole society. That's the balance, the large green bar. So if I've done a good job of presenting this information, you might be thinking, well, this is obviously a good idea. Why aren't we seeing more of it? Why aren't we already receiving dividends from all kinds of common assets as a matter of course? There are people working on these ideas, and there are obstacles to implementing them. To close, I'd like to highlight just one obstacle in particular. People are often suspicious of social programs that involve handing out money. The basic income community encounters this. Study after study shows that if you just give people money, they will use it responsibly to improve their lives. But the idea of basic income still encounters political resistance because the idea of unearned income is burdened with negative associations. We belong to a culture that values thrift and hard work and looks down on shortcuts that excuse us from thrift and hard work. Thoreau is a good cultural representative of that ethic. From exertion come wisdom and purity, he writes in Walden. From sloth, ignorance, and sensuality. What exercise is to the body, employment is to the mind and morals. If you would avoid uncleanness, work earnestly. I want to suggest that we need to get past those Yankee work ethic hangups and get used to the idea of accepting some unearned income. In the first place, we need to remember that the wealth that derives from common assets already exists and is going somewhere. If we declare ourselves too pure to be accepting a piece of it ourselves, our own fair share, then we are acquiescing that it continue to go elsewhere, which generally means to the rentier class, those who own the assets and those who own the corporations that own the assets. And more fundamentally, we need to recognize that in spite of our work ethic, we really accomplish almost nothing on our own. The farmer who is self-sufficient is reaping a bounty to which they made some small contribution, but which really is mostly attributable to nature. We are in no position to consider ourselves too dignified to accept free handouts because in relation to nature, that is practically all we do. Our job description on this planet is basically receiver of free gifts. And it would behoove us to think of ourselves that way and to accept and share the gifts of nature graciously and with humility. And on that topic, just to close, here's another essential book, The Gift by Thoreau Society's own Lewis Hyde. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes, actually almost 15 minutes. John, we had a second microphone, I believe. What was I think it was Dr. King said we have, in this country, we have socialism for the wealthy and hard work. Paraphrase. Questions?
Hi, so this is for you, Richard. The slave driver quotation.
Yes.
Can you remember Because he basically argues, right, that it's worse the like an inner slave, rather than an outer one, and that's been criticized a little bit.
Yeah.
For the obvious reason that there's some privilege suggested there, and that, you know, being an outer slave would be much worse. On the other hand, Thoreau, of course, uses exaggeration to make his points, so I wonder if you could comment on that particular quotation.
Well, yeah, the slave imagery is certainly to be regretted, but I read it as thorough. I mean, you know, a very willful type A person who is driven by their urges to acquire or get things done or whatever can be, you know, driving you to exhaustion. And so I don't think it's, yeah, I mean, it's a problematic image, but I think we, you know, we drive ourselves to distraction, we drive ourselves away from what matters, drive ourselves away from true life. And so Thoreau was saying, asking us to, you know, not obey these external forces that are telling us to do things that aren't good for us. I mean, that would be one way to refer it. What exactly was your question about, besides the slave driver imagery being bad, being not so great? What was your point?
But I just wanted to hear what you thought of that. Rebecca Neal Gould has an essay called The Whiteness of Gold, and then she questions that particular quotation.
Okay, yeah, that's a valuable insight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's just something to think about.
Yeah,
That's actually the kind of ambiguity that I think Peter was making sparkle and address, which is to say, on the one hand, do you have a political abolitionist movement that attacks the external condition of slavery as a harshness, or do you, in a sense, dilute the political force that you attack by making slavery a metaphor for everything that is forced upon an individual without his or her consent?
Thank you. Yeah, I have a book in my library. It's the history of patriarchy by Herder Lerner, and in it there's a chapter called "Female Slave." In this, she maintains that the first slaves were women for at least the first 1,000 years of the institution. And then Margaret Fuller, I just read her book by Megan Marshall twice, and she has the same sentiments that, you know, the subservient role of women, which still exists, is that they're essentially slaves.
I read the microphone out. This question for Bob. Bob, you mentioned that that sort of dominant metaphor about the Boston Tea Party emerged in the 1820s. And I wonder how it emerged and what was the metaphor or the terminology about that event or series of events that existed previous to the 1820s?
So it was called in the 1770s, and after the destruction of the tea, no party ever. And only in the 1820s, with the publication of some of the memoirs of people who had been sworn to secrecy, the collection did become known as the Boston Tea Party. I have to say, I haven't looked back just to be able to tell you the origin of Tea Party as a term, and I realized we really need to look that up.
I would just add that 1825 was the 50th anniversary of the revolution. You know, our 50th college reunion has a special resonance, and at that time, in 1825, the Revolutionary War was actually closer in memory than the Vietnam War is to us today.
By the way, when we were pausing, I just want to thank each of you for your papers. I meant to do that before I asked that question, but I appreciate each of the different things you all.
I'd like to pick up on something you were saying, Rich. I appreciated your remarks. But in some ways, Thoreau is counter-revolutionary. Obviously, he is radical in his thinking, but there's a sense in which well, there's a similarity between Thoreau and the classical writers that he was immersed in, like the Seneca, Aurelius, Lucretius, Cicero. Martha Nussbaum says that these philosophers are therapeutic in their approach, suggesting by that we are caught up in our daily lives, and in the course of which we feel anxiety, fear, suffering, and so on. But they are therapeutic in the sense that they not only give an analysis of the way we're living our lives, but also a means for a cure. And I kind of read Walden in the same way. The longest chapter is the first chapter, Economies, where he's describing, you know, the everyday lives of his fellow citizens. But the rest of the book is the therapy, is the cure for the suffering, the anxiety, the fear that we feel. I think that's kind of picking up on some of what you were saying, and certainly the way I read Thoreau in a kind of countercultural, counter-revolutionary way.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. Suffering has been self-inflicted since the beginning of time. So I think that's what Thoreau was speaking about in slave trade. Were you saying you see a stoicism as a main theme in Walden?
Yes, I think there are certainly stoic elements, but I think he would say that that's a common condition of human beings.
Yeah.
We don't need to be Aurelius or Lucretius or Cicero. We know this from our own experience. But yes, he's similar to those. Well, philosophy is a way of life, which Pierre Hadot spoke so eloquently.
Thank you.
Thank you. This one is for Brent. Thank you very much. Thank you all for the talks. It's more curiosity, this one for you. I wonder if you would want to speak a little more about Lewis Hyde's book and some points how his vision also of a universal basic income and what it might ensue from that. Also, I'm thinking we've had some debate also in my country, Sweden, about universal basic income. Some would maintain that we have it already through redistribution from taxes, social security, and so on. But I reckon not that it's a very bureaucratic system. But I wonder if you would speak to some of the potential benefits. I guess you could couch it as it might encourage innovation and creativity, but also maybe you could couch it even in capitalistic terms. If you have a certain base, that would encourage risk-taking from the capitalist vantage. Something along that score. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for those questions. I'll just respond to 2 or 3 thoughts that come in response to that. So basic income, people aren't aware of the idea of guaranteed minimum income guaranteed by the government. And there's a lot of research on the topic, a lot of research being done. One of the findings, as I pointed out, was that experiments have been done. If you give people money, there are concerns, will they spend it on alcohol, will they gamble away? Most people use it to improve their lives. So there's research being done in this area. And often, when people talk about improving their lives, it could mean fixing the roof, could mean exploring educational opportunities, and it can mean if you got a secure enough base for yourself, taking entrepreneurial risks. Those are some effects. Lewis Hyde's book. So it's a wonderful book. So it's part anthropology and looking at what does it mean to give gifts. Gifts can be reciprocal, or if you're receiving a gift from nature, you can't return your gift to nature. You have to pass it forward, and that's so there are true models of gift giving, and the second one is very powerful. And the second theme of the book is actually the art and the artist and what it means to be an artist, including a writer. Wonderful book. I feel like there was even more in your question, but maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
This is a question for all of you. I enjoyed the papers very much, but I was going to start with something that Rich said, and I don't know if he was quoting Thoreau or not, but he talked about a peaceable revolution occurring on a larger and more invisible cycle. I thought that was an interesting way to think of revolution, and because we often think of the American Revolution as occurring on certain dates. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary, and also we often, as in Bob Gross' paper, he was sort of talking about Thoreau's descendants being either a patriot or a loyalist based on military service. And so I thought this is just kind of an interesting way that Thoreau was imagining revolution as something that was unlimited, expansive, and also did not require a war. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that.
Sure. Well, the quote, peaceable revolution is in Resistance to Civil Government, that's the quote. The rest of that was paraphrased by myself. But I think it goes to kind of a central point of my paper, which is that there is a difference between a revolt and revolving. Revolving being a process that happens over a longer period of time, an inward movement toward being a different kind of person.
Well, maybe one of the implications of what I put together is that Thoreau knew a different history of the American Revolution than the one he publicly wrote. Think about that. For all the ways in which we want to admire him, he is as ready to sign on to the simplification of the American Revolution in public rhetoric as the most spread eagle orator of the antebellum period. And why? Was it that to come to terms with the Joneses, keep up with the Joneses, if you will, was to have to acknowledge the slaveholding of his family. And he's not alone. Ralph Waldo Emerson never said a word about the slaveholding of his grandfather, the Reverend William Emerson, or his great-grandfather, Daniel Bliss. Nor did Mary Brooks, the driving force in the country, female anti-slavery society, say anything about the fact that she descended from 3 generations in a row of slaveholders in Massachusetts. Why? How is it that those who were most active, most vocal in the call for immediate emancipation of slaves were themselves reluctant to acknowledge the role of slaveholder in their own families?
Shame.
You know, before we, and I think it wonders that the abolitionist movement, Southern strategy, demonizing Southern planting. You could not demonize Southern planting without demonizing their own note. And so better to be silent about that and keep the strategy than admit the complication of slaveholding in the nation's past. But to do that is to open so many cans of worms that they might not have been. But, part of the point of reading, there's not much evidence. It's all, I can only speculate. You can't look at Emerson Journal and say, should I bring up? Should I not? Oh, trust thyself. You can't find them. But if you can't have honesty about the complex heritage we inherit, then you're just inventing more myths that will collapse in confrontation with reality.
Thank you.
I just want to thank Bob for helping me understand why Thoreau liked sassafras tea.
Thank you all. On that note, enjoy some refreshments. Our next panel is 10:45 right here. Thank you.